In this video, we're going to cover two books again, Ezra and Nehemiah, which may seem a little strange, whereas 1st and 2nd Kings are obvious. But the truth is, Ezra and Nehemiah probably were at one time one book that have been divided in half. So they do make sense, and they cover kind of the same idea. So we're going to look at them together in this one video. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah take place at the end of the 5th century, somewhere around 450 years before Christ. And they follow the disastrous consequence of Israel's sin, both nations, north and south. For the people have lost their land. They've been taken into exile. They've been forced to intermingle with foreigners. And we saw King Nebuchadnezzar in 2nd Kings has burned the city and the temple, taken all of its treasure, leaving the place in ruin. And during this time, we get to read about characters like Daniel living in Babylon, trying to remain their faith and loyalty. Cover those again in the next section. But this time, the season of exile away from the land wouldn't last forever. The prophets actually foretold that. They said, this isn't going to be forever. God is not going to let this go on forever. He's going to bring you back. In the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which we didn't cover in this lecture series, but they end by telling us that after 70 years, just as the prophet Jeremiah predicted, the Babylonian Empire, which took over the Assyrian Empire, has now fallen. And an even greater empire, the Persians, take over, who are led by a great king named Cyrus. And Cyrus is actually a very famous historical figure, not just in scripture, but in world history. And Cyrus has a much different and favorable view of the Jewish people. Now, I'm not going to use this time to get into how much of that relates to what happened in the story of Daniel or places. It might have. But generally speaking, Cyrus, what we see from history, was a leader who had a much greater level of what you'd call tolerance or respect for various religions. And he actually attributes some of his success to who he calls the Lord of Heaven, or the great God, who he at some point comes to connect with the God of the Jews. Now, it can be a little bit confusing when you read some of this, because you can think, so wait, did Cyrus become a Jew, or did he become a real believer? Here's the thing to keep in mind. Like most people of the day, Cyrus was a pagan. He believed in multiple gods. And we covered this a bit when we talked about Genesis and Exodus. But because he believed in multiple gods, he believed that some were bigger and stronger, and he wanted all the gods to be happy with him. If you live in that day, every god might have ability to help you or hurt you. So for Cyrus, to know that the Jews served a great and powerful God, he wasn't a monotheist. He didn't believe that was the only God. He just believed that was a powerful God that should be cared for. So desiring to honor that God, he decreed that the Israelites should be free to return home now after 70 years and rebuild their temple. And even he returned some of their treasure. So he's like, I want to make sure this God is happy. You guys go back, build your temple, and pray for me and my kids, and make sure that God of yours is happy with me. So it makes a little more sense when you understand how they thought about the world. So many of the people that we start in the book of Ezra, especially the first two chapters listed, have spent their entire lives as slaves or exiles in a foreign land. Again, 70 years, the average person didn't live 70 years in the ancient world. So after 70 years, you're now probably in your second or even third generation of people who have grown up in Babylon and other areas. And they're now returning to their land and attempting to restore their lives to the way they used to be, to begin to rebuild the temple in their city of Jerusalem, their capital, and try to restore things again. But it wasn't without problems, and they faced tremendous opposition. They actually give up completely when Cyrus dies, and his grandson Xerxes and his son Artaxerxes force them to stop construction. You got to read the thing for yourself, but there's a lot that happens. They're told, these people are rebellious. Hey, they were destroyed for a reason. You need to stop them, and back and forth. So Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of opposition and trying to rebuild things. Finally, what you'll see is his grandson Darius takes over as the emperor, as a ruler, and ends up finding his great-grandfather Cyrus's original decree and gives the people permission to finish the job. And this is like a second wave of people now, a century later, including someone named Ezra and Nehemiah, and their return is recorded in these books. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but essentially what you're seeing, here's the thing. You have the initial wave of people who come back at 70 years under Cyrus, but they don't really get much done because there's a lot of opposition. And then years later, maybe somewhere 30, 40, 50 years later or so, we don't know, you have another wave of people who come back, and that includes Ezra and Nehemiah when things finally get completed. Again, originally one book, it tells the story of how this second wave pick up the work and push through to finish the task of rebuilding and restoring the city and the temple. And so essentially what this does is, and this is the best way to think about these two books, Ezra and Nehemiah are both work projects, right? They both focus on building something. And they're both very important work projects. So they're like two things that have to get rebuilt. And then within their rebuilding projects, there's also an attempt at reforming the way that people live, calling people back to faithfulness. So the first half, what we call Ezra, recounts the rebuilding of the temple. The place where God would dwell, where worship would happen, which is important, remember, because their whole lives were centered around God. And so the temple had to be rebuilt for them to begin to restore who they were. So Ezra rebuilds the temple, and then the priest Ezra calls people back to covenant faithfulness. While Nehemiah, the second half or second book, rebuilds the wall around Jerusalem. Why is that important? Well, because without a wall, they'll never be safe. And if they're not safe, the people will never fully return and restore and rebuild. So the wall has to get rebuilt. So there's two projects. You could think of it this way. There's the temple and then there's the city. You might think of it that way. And Ezra and Nehemiah are rebuilding both of these things that have been destroyed. So the book also deals, though, along with building these things, it deals with the problem they now have. So remember in the last lecture video when we talked about how the Assyrians and the Babylonians, their policy when they conquered nations was to take a bunch of the people away and send them to foreign lands and bring people from other foreign lands they conquered and populate this land. By mixing people around, it was their way of controlling them and keeping them from falling into rebellion. Well, now that you have the people who'd been taken away are returning, they're coming back to the land that was theirs. Well, there's currently people living there. There are people that were conquered by the Persians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians who've been brought to this land, who've now been living here for maybe 100, 200 years. And now you have these foreigners, quote unquote, coming and saying, this is our land. Well, that's an issue, right? There's tension. Here's the crazy thing. This was, like I said, 4th, 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago. This conflict is still going on in this same land today in the 21st century. And so this issue, and there's the intermixing and the problem of the intermixing. What does it look like to share the land with foreigners and try to not fall into the foreigners' paganism, to not marry these people and fall back in their idolatry? Remember, we're in this problem because we mixed with these people. But you now also have people who don't even know the Torah. They don't even know the law. They haven't been raised in it. They've been raised in paganism in Babylon. And so they have to be retaught it all, like everything. It feels like you're almost completely starting over, to be reminded of who they were, what their people were called to be about, and decide whether or not they would actually obey or keep making the same problems. So it's like Ezra and Nehemiah are almost like another turning point, another shift of, will we actually do this right this time? So let's walk through these books together. We'll kind of treat them as one book, but we'll walk through the structure of Ezra and then Nehemiah and show the story together, and then walk through a couple of main points or big ideas, okay? Starting with the book of Ezra, the first 8 chapters chronicle their return home. It begins with the actual return, where you have Cyrus decreeing the people can go back and rebuild their city and temple, and it gives a list of names of who's going to go and begin doing it. Then you have the temple construction beginning. People begin to worship the right way and their celebration, and they lay the foundation that they're going to build it upon. There's this weird moment when they lay the foundation, when it says there was this roar from the crowd that was actually a mixture of sadness and joy at the same time. And which is a really interesting moment, right? And what you're seeing essentially is you have a few people who maybe are really old and remember, maybe they're 70, 80 years old, and they remember how great and awesome the first temple was, or at least heard about it from their parents. And when they see this new foundation being so much smaller and not nearly as nice, there's almost like we've lost so much. Whereas the young people who didn't know are just glad that something's happening. They're shouting for joy. There's this mix of generations. But then, just as they're getting going, the construction is halted. Again, remember, there's foreigners living in the land, and these foreigners are opposing this. They're like, we don't want you coming in here and taking our land and building temples to your gods here. And so they write to the current king, this is a little bit later, who's now Xerxes, and say, these people are troublemakers. We know that their forefathers started a rebellion, and they've come in here they're building it again. They're going to rebel again. You need to stop them. So some of the people stop. At this time, you also have some prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, who we'll read about in the next section, who begin to challenge the people and say, don't stop, keep building, keep going. But actually they do stop and it doesn't go well and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, then you have the next king who they send an appeal, and Darius, who's now taken over for Xerxes, there's a lot of names, I know, it's okay, you don't have to memorize them all. Darius gets a notification, like, what's going on? And Darius searches the records, and when he searches the records, he finds the decree of his great-grandfather Cyrus saying that they should be allowed to build. And so Darius, like, they were allowed to let him keep building. So after a halt and a season of them not building, they finally keep at it, and they rebuild the temple. And so that becomes a big moment. And when they rebuild the temple, you then see this character, this person named Ezra, returns. Now, Ezra is an important figure, okay? Because Ezra is a teacher of the law who knew Torah, who studied it throughout the whole exile. So picture this with me. The whole nation is destroyed. People are scattered. Some people are taken off to foreign lands and raised in paganism. So many of these people probably lost access to the Torah. They probably didn't even know it. They didn't know what it said. They hadn't been raised in it. They might have known they were Jewish, but they didn't know what all it included. There were very few teachers left. So Ezra was a very important figure. He held on to the law. He was taught it. He knew it. So he returns to the land. We're now, 100 or so years later, and Ezra is like the source of information. He's the teacher who can say, hey guys, here's what it says. Here's what we're supposed to do. So he comes to the people and instructs them how to live. He reads the law to them and tells them how they're supposed to establish the priesthood, how they're supposed to live, what it means to be Jewish. And there's this moment where people are just like, what? We didn't know any of that. And then picking up in chapter 9, you have Ezra who realizes upon arriving that the people who stayed behind have intermarried, given over to other religions, and many who are returning have done the same thing. He realizes it's a mess. And as a teacher of the law, he knows that this is exactly what led them to exile in the first place, the inability to be faithful and fully obedient to God. He's ashamed. He prays this apology to God, recognizing they deserved what they got. And the people around him hear him praying and begin to repent and cry, realizing what they had done was wrong. It's like this moment where reality is sinking in. Oh, we brought this upon ourselves. Our ancestors brought this upon ourselves. We need to change. And Ezra challenges the priests, not everyone, just the priests, to send away their wives of foreign religions and completely be holy before God and the new temple. So there's this call to come back to faithfulness, to remember what they were called to way back in Deuteronomy and actually live it out this time. And then you sort of turn the page in your Bible and you go to a new book. Again, you're probably just continuing the story in the original Hebrew, but you get into Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is happening about the same time as Ezra. He is a cupbearer under Artaxerxes, and he's burdened in hearing the work isn't completed. So Nehemiah is probably someone who's never even been to Israel. He's probably been born and raised in the courtroom of the Persian king, but he knows that he's still a Jew in his heart, and he hears about it, and it moves him. And so he asks if he can go and help rebuild and get the work going again. And so there's a lot of really great things about Nehemiah. It's a really good book. I encourage you to spend some time in it. For one is, why is Nehemiah even allowed to go do this? And what we see is Nehemiah is faithful in small things, and he wins the favor of the king. So when the moment comes, the king allows him to. Such a great lesson for our lives. But in the story itself, what we see then is Nehemiah, like Ezra, comes to the city. He arrives and he inspects the wall, and he realizes, like, okay, we're getting the temple built, great, but we've got to get the wall built. If we don't get the wall built, this thing's going to fall apart. So he begins a project, delegating workers to take sections and complete it. Excellent managerial skills. There's a lot of leadership principles you can learn in Nehemiah. But just like in Ezra, we see there's opposition. People want to stop him. They want to try to, keep him doing it. Because again, the people that currently live there don't want these Jewish people coming and rebuilding. But Nehemiah stands faithful, refuses to give up. And of course, then you get to coming back to, he institutes some care for the poor, some reforms and things like that. But in chapter 8, you really get to the heart of the matter. Israel is called to renew the covenant, which again, that's what so much of this is about, the covenant relationship. Just like with Abraham initially, the Israelites, after leaving Egypt, the second generation on Joshua, and the entire nation under Solomon, and the dedication of the first temple, here once again, many, many times we've seen it so far, the people are reminded of the contract, of the deal they have made with God. Nehemiah and Ezra stand before the people and say, guys, look at what happened. Look, Moses offered the people. Joshua offered the people. Look at what Solomon said to the people. We have been given an offer from God to be his special people and be blessed in exchange for loyalty. We have to decide, will we actually follow it? And so renewing the covenant is calling a new generation to join in and pledge loyalty, just like we saw in Deuteronomy and Joshua. It's repeating. It's almost like we're starting over. Will you be the generation that does it? So in this moment, Ezra reads the law and reminds and teaches everyone just what God asks of them. And when they hear Ezra read it, they realize they confess their sin, their disloyalty, recounting their history and all the mistakes they've made that led them to this point. And just like the first group, all the way back in Deuteronomy, they're publicly asked, will you be faithful to the covenant? And they sign their names in agreement, promising, we're going to do it right this time. We're going to be faithful. And they end by repopulating the city, consecrating the walls, the temple's built, things are rebuilt. Okay. Then in the end of Nehemiah chapter 13, Israel purifies itself. The story actually ends with a scene very similar to Numbers, where Nehemiah acts with zeal against someone dishonoring the temple and all those who were unfaithful, as well as reinforcing obedience to the law, the Sabbath. We're going to do it right. We're going to follow and obey God. Now, this section may seem harsh, and it is a bit harsh, but remember, it was leniency that led to their problems. It was not being loyal to God. It was not following the Torah that led to their problems. Keep that in mind, okay? One of the most important things I want you to glean from studying this stuff is that idea. By this point in their history, they have now learned if they are not following Torah and being loyal to God by doing what the law says, it will bring about disaster for them. And the final chapter in the story is a generation once again trying to get it right and be faithful. So that moment would then mark the next 4 centuries leading up to Jesus. People now realizing we've got to be loyal to God. We've got to obey Torah. So let me get into some themes, and we're going to come back to what I just said. Some are the same, some are a couple new ones. First, God's sovereignty. God, throughout this story and Esther, which we're not going to cover in this video, but we see great and powerful rulers being used for God's purposes. The author wants us to see that God is in control. Even Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and Darius, these great world leaders, ultimately did what God wanted them to do. They're just pawns in God's master plan. God is faithful, and he makes promises, nothing will stop him. And the return at the end is a sign that even though they sinned, God still loves them and brings them back. So God's sovereignty. There's also the idea of national identity. Upon returning and facing all the sin and people who had intermarried and broken faith, they now face the issue of how do you know who is and isn't a true faithful Israelite? This isn't a small thing. This isn't a tiny thing. This is a huge thing. You now have all these foreigners living there. And you even have people who have sort of kept some of Judaism, but lost some of it. That would be known as Samaritans. There's this question now of what would it look like to be faithful? What will it look like to be what we're supposed to be? Restoring their place in the land mattered, but they didn't fully control it any longer. They didn't govern their own land. They were still subjects of Persia. Soon they would be subjects of Greece, and then they'd be subjects of the Romans. And they had other people living in the land. Not all could be seen as full descendants of Abraham anymore. How would we know who is and is not a person of the covenant? How will we know whether you're in or not? Well, here's the answer. Obedience to the law. We will know who is and isn't a true faithful Israelite by whether or not they obey and follow Torah, right? So we're going to know now, if you're not following Torah, you're not in. Now, in the New Testament, we see a group of people called the Pharisees, who Jesus often wrestled with for being maybe a little bit overly legalistic and all about the law. But can you see why now? The Pharisees were the people who believed that all of their problems came from not being loyal to God. And the way to be loyal to God was to follow his commands. They believed their problems went back to not keeping the law. So keeping the law is what God wanted. And, if you think about that for a second, does that change a little bit how you might read the gospel accounts? The Pharisees were the good guys all the way up to this point. If you'd gone back in any way in the 4 centuries leading up to Jesus, the Pharisees were the good guys. They were the ones trying to call people to faithfulness. They were the descendants of those who here returned and believed they needed to restore faithfulness to God and obey the covenant completely in order to make things right. Their obedience to the law would mark them as true, faithful Israelites and children of promise. And they also saw the Torah as the way to now connect with God. A lot of them had been taken into exile and couldn't come and worship in the temple. So the Torah, the law, the written word became central. It used to be about the temple, but again, now it was shifted towards the commands. And they had this saying, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am when you study Torah. It was a phrase that arose when people were living in exile, away from the temple, unable to access God's presence. They believed they could when they read his words. And this would continue on even now in how we read the Bible. So the Pharisees, these groups of people, the Zealots, all of these people that you see in the New Testament are now being formed in this season of like, we've got to be faithful. We can't let this happen again. But all that being said, my last point is this. Think of what all happened when God fully restored his people. The land, peace, his presence. They didn't really have the land. They were sort of back, but they were sharing it with pagans, and they were under the oppression of foreign rulers. And there wasn't much in the way of peace. They weren't overly prosperous. They were, a lot of times you see the Jewish people were suffering in poverty and overly taxed. And they're at war all the time. So weren't a lot of peace. But worst of all, God's presence didn't fall on the temple the way it did with Moses and Solomon, where the Shekinah glory of the Lord, we don't see that happening. So they're still kind of waiting for God to return. So the exile was not actually fully over. They had sort of returned to the land, but it really was still, there was still a sense among the people that it still isn't quite what it's supposed to be. We don't yet have a true king on the throne. God's presence hasn't returned, and we haven't found the peace and flourishing that God has promised for our lives. When will that happen? Well, we believe it will. We believe an anointed one, a Messiah, a rightful king will come. And when he does, then we'll have peace and blessing and flourishing, and God will have returned to his people. When the rightful true king sits on the throne. So that is the end of the narrative of Israel, their story. It kind of ends there. You have the story of Esther after this, but from this point on, the Bible then shifts to different sections. It'll now shift. You'll get into the writings of Israel, some of the poetry, the wisdom literature, and then you'll get into the prophets. And the prophets are not in chronological order for the narrative, but you can look at where each prophet lived in their story and see what they were prophesying about. And when we cover that section in future videos, I'll say, this took place during this section of 1 Kings, this prophet lived during Ezra, things like that. But really, this is kind of the end of their story up until Jesus comes in terms of the scriptures. Now, it's not the end of the story at all in terms of writings. There are other books written that cover and discuss their history in this time. Specifically, the books of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees tell the story of kind of the Jewish people under Greek reign, but those aren't included in our scriptures. So there are places you can learn about what happens for the next 400 years, but in terms of their actual history story in the Bible, it kind of ends here and then picks back up in Matthew. So we are now going to shift. In the next section, we'll begin to cover the writings, the poetry, and proverbs and wisdom literature of Israel, and then look in the prophets after that. So keep with us, and we'll keep going together. Thanks, guys.